So, way back in Jewish history, a little faith history for you this morning. Way back in Jewish history, there was a man named Abram. And it came to be that God made a covenant with this man. The terms of the covenant stated that if Abram would leave the place where he was living and go with God to an undisclosed destination, then God would make him the father or the ancestor of a great nation, and God would give to Abram and his descendants a land of their very own. Well, long story short, Abram did what he was asked to do. He left his home, he left his family, he followed God faithfully to the land of Canaan, and along the way, God changed Abram's name to Abraham, which seems to mean the father of many. And because Abraham was so faithful, he did become the father of many and the patriarch of a great nation. Choir, you're way behind me this morning. All right. The nation that Abraham fathered was Israel, and his descendants are the Israelites, or the Hebrew people, those people who would later be known as the Jews. But during his lifetime, Abraham never took possession of the land that God promised to him and to his descendants. Long after Abraham died, his descendants, the Israelites, went down into Egypt. And it all started out as a good and profitable expedition, but before it was all over with, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, had made slaves of the Israelites, and they ended up being enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. They suffered a lot of misery during that time. And then one day, God asked another man, a man named Moses, to be an instrument of God's promise. God told Moses to go to Egypt and to rescue the Hebrew people and to take them back to the land of Canaan, the very land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants 6 centuries earlier. In our passage this morning, the Israelites are sitting at the border of that promised land, a region that they came to know as flowing with milk and honey. That was their expectation. In other words, this was a very prosperous and abundant territory. The Israelites escaped Egypt. They wandered around in the wilderness for those 40 years, and now they are waiting to cross the Jordan River and take possession of their land. They waited a very long time for the fulfillment of this promise. So you and I can probably imagine the excitement that they felt as they anticipated crossing the river and laying claim on what God had given them. But before they could do that, Moses gave them some very important instructions, part of which Brooks just read for us a few moments ago. Moses said, when you enter this land that God is giving to you, and you take possession of it and you settle there, then take some of the first fruits of all the produce of that land that God is giving you. Put it in a basket, take it to the priest, and when you present it to the priest, say to him, I declare to the Lord your God that I have come to the land that God swore to us. Up to this point, the Israelites never had a land of their own. They had been wandering nomads from the very beginning. But all of that was about to change. When they entered Canaan, they would build homes, they would plant crops, they would raise families, they would establish towns. This land would be theirs, and they would be God's. But in the text, they still have to enter Canaan. They still have to settle it. They still have to contend with the people who are already living there. They still have to cultivate the soil and gather in the resources so that they can build homes and build towns. They still have to provide protection for the families that they're going to raise there. And before they can do any of that, they still have to cross over the Jordan River. But I hope you notice that Moses speaks to them as though this is a done deal. He says, when you've entered the land and taken possession of it and settled it. Not if you do these things, but when you do these things. He spoke to them as though there was no question about it all being accomplished. And there was no question about it because God was with them. And this was God's promise. And this was God's plan. And God's plan doesn't fail. So Moses felt it necessary to give the Israelites these instructions for a harvest celebration. They would definitely plant a crop, and they would most certainly reap what they had sowed. And when they did that, they were to take the very first and the very best of that crop and give it to God. They were to give it as a joyful act of worship and of gratitude for all that God is and all of the faithfulness with which God carries out God's work. They would lay it in a basket full of thanks and present it on the altar, and the whole community together would rejoice in the good which God has given. I think the instructions for this time of worship and thanksgiving are very important at this point in Israel's story. They seem to be very intentional instructions that look back on and hopefully help to alleviate the constant complaining of the Israelites from the time they left Egypt until they arrived at Canaan. Scripture tells us that they complained about everything. They complained about the journey. They complained about where they were going. They complained about the food. They complained about the water. They complained about Moses. They even complained about God. And in the midst of all that grumbling, they failed to acknowledge their newly found freedom. They were no longer slaves, and yet still they grumbled. And they failed to acknowledge how much better their lives were, how much they had been given, how much progress they were making along the way, and how much God loved them and cared for them and carried them. In the midst of all that grumbling and their negative attitude, they failed to recognize that the very journey itself was the necessary means by which God would accomplish all that God promised to Abraham and all that God promised to them through Abraham. The instructions that Moses gave the Israelites for thanksgiving as they perched there on the promise, waiting to enter the promised land, those instructions helped to assure them that God had been actively involved the entire time. God had been actively working and would continue to do so, would continue to bring things about on their behalf to accomplish great things for them. Things promised to them even centuries before in a covenant that God made with a man named Abram. I love this story for us on the Sunday before Thanksgiving on Thursday, because it helps to remind us that we should walk thankfully into the future. It encourages us to gratefully appreciate and anticipate what God is about to accomplish in our lives on our behalf. Each of us has been called, just like Abraham, to follow God to an undisclosed destination. We can't possibly know what lies ahead. But each of us has also been called, just like Moses, to be an instrument of all that God has promised to do. The journey we're on, it's the means through which God will accomplish all of the good that God has already spoken into our lives. And of course there will be times of hardship. Of course there will be times of suffering, even great suffering, just as the Israelites experienced in that time of slavery. There are times when the journey will be difficult, and we can respond to that with grumbling. We can complain along the way because, we have to go too far, and there's too little to depend on, and the road is too uncertain. And I've certainly known my share of people who greet every day with some new complaint. But there is another option. We can instead rejoice over what awaits us, the fulfillment of a blessed promise in God through Christ. Each day is an adventure in living. And it helps to greet that day in an attitude of gratitude. We've spent quite a bit of time over the last several months in the Gospel of Luke. And Luke presents Jesus as a Moses figure who leads God's people into the kingdom of heaven, this land of milk and honey, which is a prosperous and abundant life lived fully in the presence of God. Jesus taught that this kingdom is our inheritance. It is the land that God has given to us. And he tells us very plainly that if we are faithful, we will enter the land. Crops will be planted, and the harvest will be bountiful. And even as we thank God right now for all that we've already received from God's hand, we can also offer God a basket full of thanks for all that is yet to come, all that will be given on our behalf in the name of God's great love and undying faithfulness. So you have your first fruits there in your bulletin. And I would like you to take some time now. The choir is going to sing another beautiful anthem for us. And as they do, I'd like you to take a little bit of time to prayerfully consider your life journey. And I want you to think about where you've come from, the distance that you've traveled, and the miles that you've covered with God. And as you prayerfully consider where you've been and where you're going, I'd like you to offer your gratitude to the Lord for all that has been accomplished by God for you. And after you've had some time to prayerfully reflect, and I'll ask you to come forward and place your fruit in the basket as a symbol of your gratitude and thanksgiving. And in a moment, we are going to offer that basket full of thanks on the altar before God, rejoicing in all the good that God has given and will continue to give on our behalf. As the choir stands to sing, I will invite you into a time of silence and contemplation.